Hello, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is to talk a little bit about the concept of realism in literature and to look specifically at how this is going to apply to Of Mice and Men. It might be helpful to just briefly review some of the situations that kind of led us into this style of realism. And the first thing to look at is really the Civil War. Now, most of you should know a little bit from your history books about this, but you'll know that this was a war that a lot of people set out with the idea of we're going to save the glorious South or we're going to save the Union, and instead it was a particularly miserable war, that concept of brother versus brother within the same family with people fighting. The soldiers became very disillusioned, the battlefield conditions were terrible, the hospitals were awful, and they saw a lot of starvation, they saw a lot of disease, they saw some horrific injuries. And the new literature kind of started to express these horrifying details. Instead of showing war as being something like King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table riding off to save the day, books like The Red Badge of Courage started to show again what the battlefield conditions were really like. And we had a magazine called Harper's Weekly, which was publishing weekly experiences of both military and civil life that really kind of disillusioned a lot of people about war being anything that might be particularly glorious or romanticized. Now, when we talk about realism versus romanticism, we're really talking about artistic styles. And this can be seen applied to literature as well as music and sculpture and even architecture and some other forms of art to some extent. Now, on the one side, you're coming from this kind of romantic period. And that's where the language was very imaginative, lots of figurative details, lots of poetic elements. The focus was pretty much on the feelings and on experiences, the individual, unique experience of what was being described. Consider it kind of like an impressionistic watercolor painting. If you're going to look at a painting of a scene that's done with watercolors, everything's kind of softened and blended, and it's going to be very individualistic. On realism, on the other hand, you have this concept of just the facts. Think of a reporter kind of pulled back, just giving the objective, observable details, not the impact, not their personal experiences, but just what you can see. And this would be the difference between, over here you have your watercolor painting, but in realism, it would be more like a photograph, like a black and white photograph that's just a snapshot of the time with nothing edited, nothing changed, nothing filtered, and that's exactly what it is. So that idea of romanticism versus realism is a way to think about the style of the literature that you're going to be reading. Here's kind of a visual way to think about it. On the left-hand side over here, you have a picture of a cafe at night, and this is by Vincent van Gogh. And you'll notice this is this impressionistic style. Things are kind of wavy, they don't have sharp outlines. What really stands out are the colors and the brightness of the stars, and then everything kind of fades into black. You can't really see what you're looking at. So this painter was sort of trying to capture the impression, the emotion of this particular scene. On the other hand, you have a painting, and yes, this is a painting, not a photograph, of a different cafe at night. And notice again how photographic these details are. The perspective is all very accurate. The lighting is very much the way it would have looked. The outlines of people are very realistic. So if you think realism versus romanticism in literature, you can kind of think of these two paintings, where on one hand, you have the romanticism with this impressionistic individualized view, and on the other hand you have the realism, which this is sort of gritty, grainy, kind of very much exactly just the facts kind of idea of what you're looking at. Now, the first author that we're going to study from this realism period is going to be John Steinbeck. And many of the authors, Steinbeck, like many of these authors, was really interested in capturing real life, not writing about some romanticized, glorified people from the past. So the subjects, instead of being kings and noble people, were the ordinary kind of people that you would find just on the street and in society. Very often they were writing about the people who were downtrodden or from the lower levels. These might be migrant workers, factory workers, farmhands, prostitutes, and criminals. And the families were not these great models of familyhood. They were imperfect and dysfunctional or even absent. A lot of the characters don't have any family ties or family connections. And the language that's used is going to reflect realistic language, which means first thing you're going to notice is there's a lot of slang, an attempt to capture sort of local dialects and expression, and even profanity. Because it really wouldn't make sense if you're trying to describe the life of a field hand to have them saying, well, gosh, golly darn it. That's not the way that these men talked. And John Steinbeck talked specifically about how he wanted his books to capture the way that the language actually existed, to kind of honor the lives of these people and these workers. Now, one characteristic of realism in America in particular is this idea of regionalism, where the author was capturing the traits of their particular area. So the writers kind of became known even based on their region. Kate Chopin was known for writing about Louisiana, Mark Twain, life on the Mississippi River, and John Steinbeck, who we're going to start with, from the California, particularly the Salinas Valley, in that particular section of that town. And these authors became very connected with this area of the country that they were from, and about capturing what life was like, what people sounded like, the dialect, the customs and the traditions of that particular region of America. So why the changeover? Why did the stylistic periods move from this kind of romanticism style into a more realistic style? Well, if you remember last year, we talked about All Quiet on the Western Front and this concept of the lost generation. And that's a lot of the same impact here in America. First of all, you had World War I, which again was supposed to be this war to end all wars. And the young people were told, go fight for your country. And instead, they found this trench warfare and this really ridiculous and very badly organized and just sort of a senseless loss of life. Then came the 1920s, which was kind of like this big party to forget about the war, and then the crash, where if the 1920s were a party, the crash was the hangover, where the stock market crashed and plunged the entire nation, actually the whole world, but in the United States in particular. We talk about the Great Depression, where you had this economic crisis with high unemployment rates, all kinds of collapses of businesses, and this was topped off with the agricultural problems of the Dust Bowl. So you'd think, well, okay, so I don't have a job at a company, but I can always go work on a farm. Well, not if your farm is all blowing up into dust and just, scattering out to the wind. So you saw this shift into this more cynical and less optimistic view, and this complete refusal to accept anything that was phony, anything in literature that was not actually telling the truth of how life really was. Again, this kind of lost generation ideal. And you'll definitely see this in Steinbeck and in Of Mice and Men. So we'll be going into more detail on this in later lessons, but just a little bit of an overview. John Steinbeck was born in 1902 and lived until 1968. Again, we talked about Salinas Valley, California. The novel itself was written in 1937 and follows the story of these two migrant workers, Lenny and George. And Steinbeck was attempting to show in this very short novel, it is a short book, so you'll be happy with that. For the first book, it's very short, showing some of the social issues of the day, all of the different problems that existed. And in just a few chapters, he really captures a lot of the problems that existed in this particular time period in California in this migrant lifestyle and life population. So when you get back to class, you should be ready to define realism. What does that term mean? Give some examples of the characteristics. What would we see if we had a novel that was written in a realistic style? Explain a little bit about why realism originated. What are some of the roots of this movement? And understand that Of Mice and Men is written in a realistic style. And that's the end for this presentation. Bye now.